The thunder rolled across the sky like a distant drum as Grace Reynolds clutched her baby closer to her chest, trying desperately to shield the infant from the biting winter wind that howled through the cracks of her dilapidated cabin. Her husband, Thomas, had left 3 weeks ago to find work in the nearby mining town, promising to return with money and provisions. But Grace knew in her heart he wasn't coming back, not after finding her mother's jewelry missing the same morning he disappeared. Wyoming Territory, 1878. Grace had never imagined she would end up alone in this unforgiving frontier, with nothing but a 6-month-old daughter and the clothes on her back. The last of her food had run out yesterday, and the milk for little Sarah was nearly gone. Grace's stomach twisted with hunger, but it was the fear in her heart that hurt the most, fear that her baby would starve while she watched, helpless. "Hush now, little one," Grace whispered, rocking the fussing infant. "Mama will figure something out." The words sounded hollow even to her own ears. As night descended and the storm intensified, Grace resigned herself to another sleepless night of worry. The cabin walls shuddered against the force of the wind, and she prayed the roof would hold until morning. She had just begun to drift into an uneasy sleep when a loud knock startled her awake. Grace froze, clutching Sarah tighter. In the 2 years she'd lived in this remote cabin, they rarely had visitors and never after dark. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Hello, anyone in there?" A deep male voice called out, barely audible over the howling wind. Grace reached for the old shotgun Thomas had left behind, though she knew it was unloaded, the ammunition long since traded for milk and flour. "I mean no harm, madam," the voice continued. "I was passing by and saw your chimney smoke, just looking for shelter from this storm." Desperation trumped caution. If this stranger meant her harm, she and Sarah would die tonight. If he didn't, perhaps there was a chance for help. "Who are you?" Grace called, her voice shaking. "Name's Caleb Dawson, madam. I'm just a cowboy caught in this storm. I've got provisions I'm willing to share." The word provisions made Grace's empty stomach clench. With trembling hands, she unbolted the door and opened it just enough to peer outside. A tall figure stood on her porch, snow dusting his broad shoulders and wide-brimmed hat. In the dim light from her oil lamp, she could make out a rugged face with several days' worth of stubble and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "Evening, madam," he said, tipping his hat. In his arms was a bundle wrapped in oilskin. "I don't mean to intrude, but this storm's something fierce." Grace hesitated, then pulled the door open wider. "Come in, Mr. Dawson, but I warn you, I have nothing to offer in return for your shelter." The man stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots before entering fully. He was even taller than she'd first thought, his frame filling the small cabin. But there was something in his manner, a gentleness that made Grace relax slightly. "Thank you kindly," he said, unwrapping his bundle. "And I don't need anything in return except a spot by your fire if you don't mind." As he removed his coat, Grace noticed the gun belt at his hip. He saw her looking and slowly unbuckled it, placing it on the table. "Just so you feel safer, madam," he explained. From his bundle, he produced a loaf of bread, some dried beef, and a small container of butter. Grace couldn't help the small gasp that escaped her lips at the sight of food. Caleb's eyes moved from Grace to the baby in her arms, then took in the barren cupboards and the thinness of her face. Understanding dawned in his expression. "When's the last time you ate, madam?" he asked quietly. Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "It's been a while," she admitted. Without another word, Caleb broke the bread and offered her a piece. "Please," he said. "Eat." With Sarah balanced in one arm, Grace took the bread with her free hand and bit into it. The simple flavor was the most delicious thing she'd tasted in weeks. Tears sprang to her eyes before she could stop them. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb nodded, a shadow crossing his face as he watched her eat with such desperation. He reached into his pack again and pulled out a small jar. "I have some preserved milk here too," he said, "for the little one." Grace looked up at him, unable to hide her gratitude or her suspicion. "Why are you helping us?" Caleb's eyes met hers, steady and sure. "Because no one should go hungry, especially not a mother and her child." He set more food on the table, then looked at her with quiet determination. "You'll never starve again, not if I have anything to say about it." In that moment, something shifted in Grace's world. She didn't know this man, this cowboy who had appeared like an answer to her desperate prayers. But as the storm raged outside and her baby finally slept with a full belly, Grace allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that perhaps they wouldn't die out here after all. Caleb insisted Grace eat more while he tended to the dying fire, adding logs from the meager pile beside the hearth and coaxing the flames back to life. The cabin gradually warmed, and for the first time in weeks, Grace felt the knot of tension in her shoulders begin to loosen. "Your husband?" Caleb asked carefully, nodding toward the empty rocking chair in the corner. Grace's face hardened. "Gone, 3 weeks now. Gone hunting, to town. Just gone," she said flatly. "Took what little valuables we had, said he was going to find work at the silver mine in Silverton." Caleb didn't press, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What's your name, madam, if you don't mind my asking?" "Grace Reynolds, and this is Sarah." She nodded toward the sleeping infant. "Beautiful names for beautiful ladies," Caleb said with a small smile. "How old is she?" 6 months next Wednesday, Caleb nodded, studying the baby's peaceful face. "She favors you, got your nose." Despite herself, Grace smiled. "That's what my mother said too before she passed." The storm continued to rage outside, wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. Caleb glanced at the poorly sealed window frames and the gaps in the floorboards. "This place needs some work," he observed. "Not fit for winter." "Thomas was supposed to fix it before the cold set in," Grace replied, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Lot of things Thomas was supposed to do." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "If the storm lets up by morning, I could make some repairs before I move on. Least I could do for your hospitality." Grace looked at him in surprise. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Dawson." "I should be the one offering payment for your kindness." "Caleb, please," he said. "And no payment necessary. My pa raised me to help folks in need. Besides," he added with a gentle smile, "it's been a while since I've had company other than my horse. Where are you headed?" Grace asked, realizing she knew nothing about this man who had so suddenly entered their lives. "Montana," Caleb replied. "Got a letter from an old Army buddy who started a cattle operation up there. Says he needs good men." "You were in the Army," Caleb nodded. "Cavalry, 5 years. Got out in 76. Grace studied him with new interest. That would explain his straight posture and direct manner. "And now you're a cowboy, among other things," he said with a smile. "I can break horses, mend fences, and even cook a decent stew if I have to. Jack of all trades, master of none, my ma used to say." As they talked, the storm gradually subsided and exhaustion began to overtake Grace. Caleb noticed her struggling to keep her eyes open. "You should rest," he said gently. "I'll keep watch." Grace wanted to protest this man was still a stranger, after all, but her body betrayed her with a massive yawn. "The rocking chair reclines a bit," she offered, gesturing to the chair in the corner. Caleb shook his head. "Floor's fine for me, madam, slept on worse." With reluctance, Grace retired to the small bed in the corner of the one-room cabin, tucking Sarah in beside her. She intended to stay awake, to keep one eye open, but the combination of a full stomach and the comforting presence of another adult in the cabin soon lulled her into the deepest sleep she'd had in weeks. When Grace awoke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the windows. For a moment, she was disoriented. She'd grown accustomed to waking before dawn with Sarah's hungry cries. Then she remembered the stranger and she sat up quickly, looking around the cabin. Caleb was gone, but the fire was burning steadily. On the table was more bread, some cheese, and another jar of preserved milk. Grace's heart sank, thinking he had left them with one last meal. But then the door opened and Caleb stepped in, his arms full of wood. "Good morning," he said cheerfully. "Hope I didn't wake you." "Thought I'd get a head start on chores while the weather's holding." Grace blinked at him, surprised. "You're still here." A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Unless you'd prefer I move on. No, Grace said quickly, perhaps too quickly. I mean, you're welcome to stay. If you still want to help with the repairs, that is. Caleb's smile returned. Already started. Your roof had a weak spot that needed patching, and I rounded up some of your chickens' looks like they scattered during the storm. Chickens, Grace repeated, confused. We don't have chickens. Now it was Caleb's turn to look surprised. There's a coop out back, though it's seen better days. Found 3 hens pecking around in the snow. Grace shook her head. Must be from the Wilsons' place. They left last fall, headed back east. Thomas said they couldn't handle frontier life. Well, they left you some layers, Caleb said. And they left 2 eggs this morning. He reached into his pocket and produced 2 small brown eggs. Breakfast? Sarah began to stir beside Grace, making small whimpering sounds that would soon turn to cries. Grace lifted her daughter, marveling at how peaceful the baby looked after a night with a full belly. I'll tend to her while you cook, Caleb offered, setting the eggs on the table. If you don't mind, that is. Grace hesitated, then carefully passed Sarah to him. To her surprise, Caleb handled the baby with practiced ease, cradling her head properly and speaking to her in soft, gentle tones. You have children of your own? Grace asked as she cracked the eggs into a small pan. A shadow passed over Caleb's face. No, he said quietly. But my sister had 4 little ones. I helped when I could. Grace noticed his use of past tense but didn't pry. Everyone in this harsh territory carried losses. It was an unspoken rule not to dig at fresh wounds. They ate breakfast together, passing Sarah between them, and then Caleb set to work on the cabin. He reinforced the door hinges, stuffed rags into the worst of the cracks around the windows, and repaired a section of the roof that had begun to leak. Grace watched him work, impressed by his efficiency and skill. By midday, the cabin already felt warmer and more secure. When Caleb announced he needed to check on his horse, Grace felt a moment of panic, fearing he wouldn't return. But he was back within the hour, leading a handsome bay gelding. This is Rusty, Caleb said, patting the horse's neck. Thought I'd bring him closer. Storm's passing, but another's brewing to the west. How can you tell? Grace asked, stepping outside to look at the clear blue sky. Caleb pointed to the distant mountains. See that haze? And the way the birds are flying low. My bones feel it too. We're in for more snow by nightfall. Grace bit her lip, looking toward the horizon. Will that delay your journey to Montana? Probably, Caleb admitted. But I'm in no rush. My friends offer stands regardless of when I arrive. He hesitated, then added, unless you're eager to have your privacy back. No, Grace said, surprising herself with her honesty. It's nice having someone to talk to, someone besides a baby, that is. Caleb smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. Well then, if you'll have me, I'd be glad to stay until the weather clears. Might be able to get this place properly winterized before I go. Grace nodded, ignoring the small voice inside that hoped the storms would continue, that this kind cowboy would have reason to stay longer. It wasn't proper, a single woman hosting a strange man, but propriety seemed a distant concern compared to survival. There's something else, Caleb said, reaching into his saddlebag. Thought the little lady might need these. He pulled out a small bundle of cloth and handed it to Grace. Unwrapping it, she found 2 tiny gowns, clearly made for an infant, and a soft knitted blanket. Grace ran her fingers over the fine stitching, tears welling in her eyes. Where did you get these? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Trading post about 10 miles back, Caleb explained. The owner's wife makes them. I noticed Sarah's gown was a bit thin for winter. Grace clutched the baby clothes to her chest, overwhelmed by this simple kindness. I can't accept these, she said, even as she held them tighter. I have no way to pay you. Caleb's expression softened. They're a gift, Grace. No payment expected or desired. The way he said her name, not Madam or Mrs. Reynolds, but Grace, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. She looked up to thank him properly and found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment they stood there in the winter sunlight, something unspoken passing between them. Then Sarah cried from inside the cabin, breaking the spell. "I should feed her," Grace said, stepping back. Caleb nodded, clearing his throat. "And I should finish those roof repairs before the next storm hits." As Grace tended to Sarah, she found herself stealing glances at Caleb through the window as he worked. There was something about his steady presence that made her feel secure for the first time since Thomas had left, perhaps even before that. Thomas had been charming and quick with compliments, but never reliable, never solid like the man currently hammering at her roof. By late afternoon, Caleb's prediction proved accurate. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, and the temperature dropped rapidly. He finished his work just as the first snowflakes began to fall, joining Grace inside as the wind picked up once again. "Glad I got that patch secured," he said, warming his hands by the fire. "Should hold through the worst of it now." Grace set a pot of stew on the hook over the fire, a simple meal made from the provisions Caleb had shared. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Caleb looked up, meeting her eyes. "No need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Grace said firmly. "They wouldn't have. Most would have ridden past this cabin without a second thought." Something in her tone made Caleb study her more carefully. "You've had a rough time of it, haven't you?" Grace turned away, stirring the stew to hide the emotion on her face. "No rougher than most out here." "That's not what I asked," Caleb said gently. For a moment, Grace considered deflecting again, maintaining the carefully constructed wall she'd built around her heart. But something about Caleb's quiet presence made her want to tell the truth. Thomas wasn't. She began, searching for the right words. "He wasn't the man I thought I married. He was charming, handsome, swept me off my feet back in St. Louis, promised me a grand adventure in the West." She laughed bitterly. "I was naive enough to believe him." Caleb remained silent, giving her space to continue if she wished. When we arrived, there was no house waiting like he'd claimed. Just this cabin, abandoned and half-rotted. He promised it was temporary, that we'd build something better in the spring. Then it was next spring. Then after the baby came. She shook her head. There was always an excuse. "And then he left," Caleb finished quietly. Grace nodded. "He'd been getting restless for months. Staying out late, coming home smelling of whiskey and perfume. I knew he was, visiting the women in town." She swallowed hard. "When I confronted him, he said I'd changed after Sarah was born, that I wasn't fun anymore." Anger flashed across Caleb's face so quickly Grace almost missed it. "Some men don't deserve the title," he said, his voice low. "The worst part is," Grace continued, surprising herself with her candor, "I knew what he was when I married him. I just didn't want to admit it." "My father warned me," said Thomas had a wandering eye and loose morals. She sighed. "But I was so determined to prove Papa wrong." "We all make mistakes when we're young," Caleb said. "The measure of a person is how they face what comes after." Grace looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. In the firelight, she could see a small scar above his right eyebrow and the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. He was handsome, but not in the flashy way Thomas had been. Caleb's was a quieter kind of appeal, strength tempered with kindness. "And what mistakes are you running from, Caleb Dawson?" she asked softly. A sad smile touched his lips. "Too many to count, I'm afraid." Before Grace could ask more, Sarah began to fuss. As Grace fed her, Caleb busied himself with the stew, giving mother and child privacy. When the meal was ready, they ate in comfortable silence, listening to the storm rage outside once more. That night, as Grace lay in bed with Sarah beside her, she found herself grateful for the howling wind that gave Caleb reason to stay. In just 2 days, his presence had transformed their desperate situation into something approaching hope. But hope was a dangerous thing, she reminded herself. Hope had led her to Thomas, and look how that had ended. Still, as she drifted off to sleep, Grace couldn't help but wonder what it might be like if Caleb Dawson decided not to continue on to Montana after all. The next morning dawned clear but bitingly cold. Grace woke to find Caleb already gone from his makeshift bed by the fire, but the telltale sounds of chopping wood reassured her of his continued presence. She dressed quickly, fed Sarah, and was just preparing a simple breakfast when the door opened, admitting a blast of cold air and a snow-dusted Caleb. "Morning," he greeted, his breath visible in the chilled air. "Got a good pile of firewood stacked outside, should last you a few days." Grace frowned at his words. "You're leaving today?" Caleb stamped snow from his boots. "Weather's cleared, trail should be passable." But he didn't sound particularly eager. "Oh," Grace said, trying to keep disappointment from her voice. "Of course, you've been delayed too long already." Caleb hung his coat and hat, then turned to face her fully. "Actually, I've been thinking," he said carefully. "Winter's setting in hard. These storms will keep coming." Grace waited, hardly daring to hope what his next words might be. "The nearest town is what, 20 miles?" he continued. 17, Grace corrected. "Pine Creek," Caleb nodded. "That's a long way to go for supplies, especially with a baby and in this weather." He ran a hand through his hair, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I was thinking I might winter here if you'd allow it, of course. I could build a lean-to behind the cabin, stock up on provisions from town. Make sure you and Sarah are set before the worst of the season hits." Grace's heart thundered in her chest. "You'd delay your journey to Montana. For us, Montana will still be there come spring," Caleb said simply. "And my friend isn't expecting me until then anyway." But Grace hesitated, practical concerns intruding on her relief. People will talk. A single woman hosting a man she barely knows. Caleb's expression grew serious. "I wouldn't do anything to compromise your reputation, Grace. I can make my camp a proper distance away if that would be more appropriate." Grace considered this, weighing propriety against the very real dangers of a Wyoming winter. "No," she decided finally. "The lean-to is sensible, and I'm not sure I care much what people think anymore. Not when Sarah's well-being is at stake." Relief washed over Caleb's face. "Then it's settled. I'll ride into Pine Creek today, get supplies, and be back before dark." "Take this," Grace said, retrieving a folded paper from a drawer. "It's a list of what we need most. I was planning to make the journey myself once the weather improved, but—" Caleb took the list, his fingers brushing hers. "Consider it done." As he prepared to leave, Grace impulsively touched his arm. "Caleb," she said softly, "thank you for everything." He covered her hand with his own, the gesture brief but warm. "Thank you for trusting me, Grace. That's no small thing out here." After Caleb departed, Grace found herself humming as she went about her chores, something she hadn't done since long before Thomas left. She washed the few dishes they had, mended one of Sarah's gowns, and even swept the cabin floor. The simple act of tidying up felt like an affirmation, a declaration that this space would continue to be a home. Sarah seemed to sense her mother's improved spirits, cooing and smiling more than usual as Grace carried her about the cabin. "What do you think of our Mr. Dawson, little one?" Grace asked, bouncing the baby gently. "He's quite different from your papa, isn't he?" Sarah gurgled in response, grabbing at Grace's hair with tiny fingers. "Yes, I think so too," Grace agreed, as if they were having a proper conversation. "He's kind, steady, the sort of man who keeps his promises." As the day wore on, Grace found herself repeatedly glancing out the window, checking the path that led toward town. The rational part of her mind reminded her that Caleb couldn't possibly return so soon. The journey to Pine Creek and back would take the better part of a day. But another part, a part she was only beginning to acknowledge, worried that he might not return at all. By late afternoon, Grace had worked herself into a state of anxiety. What if Caleb had simply used the trip to town as an excuse to leave without a proper goodbye? What if he'd never intended to return? After all, what did she really know about this man? Just as her fears were reaching their peak, she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. Rushing to the window, Grace saw a familiar figure on horseback, leading a second horse loaded with supplies. The relief that flooded through her was so intense it made her lightheaded. She stepped outside, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the cold, and waited as Caleb approached. "Wasn't sure you'd come back," she admitted when he was close enough to hear. Caleb reined his horse to a stop, surprise evident on his face. I gave my word, didn't I? Grace smiled, embarrassed by her doubt. You did, I'm sorry. No need to apologize, Caleb said, dismounting. Trust is earned, not given. He began unloading packages from the second horse. Speaking of which, I ran into some interesting folks in town. Grace tensed. Oh, seems your husband made quite an impression before he left, Caleb said carefully. He owes money to half the businesses in Pine Creek. Grace closed her eyes briefly. I'm not surprised. The general store owner, Davis, was particularly vocal about it. Said Thomas Reynolds bought supplies on credit, promising to pay when he returned from the silver mine. Caleb paused in his unloading. When I mentioned I was staying at your cabin for the winter, his attitude changed mighty quick. He thinks you're harboring a thief's wife, Grace said flatly. Actually, Caleb corrected, he was relieved to hear someone was looking after you and the baby, said he'd been worried but hadn't had time to check on you himself. Grace blinked in surprise. Mr. Davis said that, Caleb nodded. He also insisted I take these. He held up a package wrapped in brown paper. Said they were baby things his wife had set aside for Sarah, but they never had a chance to deliver them. Tears pricked at Grace's eyes. I didn't realize. I thought everyone in town would blame me for Thomas's actions. Quite the opposite, Caleb said, handing her the package. They were concerned about you. Davis even extended credit to me when I explained the situation, said any friend of yours was welcome in his store. As they carried the supplies inside, Grace felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She had been so isolated, so afraid of judgment, that she'd forgotten the fundamental kindness that often flourished in frontier communities. Among the supplies Caleb had brought were flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, salt pork, and most precious of all, a small container of milk powder for Sarah. There were also nails, tools, lamp oil, warm blankets, and even a small rocking horse carved from pine. For when she's a bit older, Caleb explained, nodding toward the toy. Grace ran her fingers over the smooth wood. It's beautiful. Local craftsman makes them, Caleb said. Thought every child should have at least one toy. As they unpacked the provisions, Grace noticed something else, a small book with a worn leather cover. What's this? She asked, picking it up. Caleb looked almost embarrassed. Just some poetry. Thought you might enjoy it during the long evenings. Grace opened the book carefully. Wordsworth, she read from the title page. You like poetry, Mr. Dawson? A faint blush colored Caleb's cheeks. My mother was a schoolteacher. She believed in the power of beautiful words, especially in hard places. Grace smiled, touched by this unexpected glimpse into Caleb's past. My father used to read Wordsworth to us on winter evenings, she said softly. I haven't thought about that in years. Then perhaps it will bring back good memories, Caleb said. That evening, after a hearty meal made possible by the new supplies, Grace read aloud from the poetry book while Caleb worked on carving a new handle for her broom. Sarah lay contentedly on a blanket between them, occasionally cooing or waving her tiny fists at the sound of her mother's voice. My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky, Grace read, her voice soft in the firelit cabin. So was it when my life began. So is it now I am a man, so be it when I shall grow old, or let me die. She paused, looking up to find Caleb watching her, his carving temporarily forgotten in his hands. My mother loved that one, he said quietly. It's beautiful, Grace agreed. Though I confess, it's been a long time since my heart leaped up at anything. Caleb's eyes held hers for a moment. Perhaps that will change. The simple statement hung in the air between them, filled with unspoken possibility. Grace felt her cheeks warm, and she quickly returned to the book, reading several more poems before Sarah's fussing indicated it was time for bed. As Grace settled the baby for the night, Caleb stepped outside to check on the horses one last time. When he returned, his expression was thoughtful. What is it? Grace asked, recognizing the slight furrow between his brows that appeared when he was troubled. Storm clouds to the north, Caleb said. Bigger than the last one, I think. I'd better start on that lean-to tomorrow. You could. Grace began, then hesitated. The cabin is small, but there's room enough for you to sleep by the fire until the lean-to is finished. Safer that way with the storm coming. Caleb studied her face as if searching for something. Are you certain? I don't want to presume. I'm certain, Grace said firmly. It's the sensible thing to do. That night, as snow began to fall once again, Grace lay awake listening to Caleb's steady breathing from his bedroll near the fire. His presence filled the cabin with a sense of security she had almost forgotten could exist. With Thomas, she had always felt as if she were standing on shifting sand. With Caleb, it was like finding solid ground after a lifetime of uncertainty. She knew it was too soon for such thoughts. Caleb was kind, yes, and honorable in a way Thomas had never been. But he was also passing through, delayed but not deterred from his original destination. Come spring, he would continue on to Montana, and she and Sarah would be alone again, unless— Grace pushed the thought away. It was dangerous to hope for too much. For now, it was enough that they would survive the winter. Anything beyond that was a luxury she couldn't afford to contemplate. As predicted, the storm that arrived the next day was fiercer than its predecessors. Caleb managed to construct a rudimentary frame for the lean-to before the worst hit, but completing it would have to wait until the weather improved. Confined to the cabin, they settled into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Caleb took charge of the heavier chores, keeping the fire fed, bringing in water from the well, caring for the horses and the 3 chickens that had taken up residence in the repaired coop. Grace cooked, tended to Sarah, and mended their clothing. In the evenings, they talked. Caleb told her about his years in the cavalry, serving on the frontier and occasionally clashing with native tribes. He spoke with respect of the Cheyenne and Arapaho he had encountered, expressing regret for the government's broken promises. Most of those conflicts could have been avoided, he said one night as they sat by the fire, if only the treaties had been honored. You sound like you sympathize with them, Grace observed. I understand them, Caleb corrected. Fighting to protect their homes, their way of life. I can respect that, even when I was on the other side. Grace studied him thoughtfully. Is that why you left the army? Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Partly, he admitted finally. Couldn't reconcile some of the orders we were given with what I believed was right. And the other part. Grace pressed gently, a shadow crossed Caleb's face. Lost my brother in a skirmish near the Powder River. He was also cavalry, different regiment. By the time I reached him, it was too late. He stared into the fire. After that, the uniform felt like a burden rather than an honor. Grace reached across the space between them, laying her hand on his. I'm sorry about your brother. Caleb turned his hand to clasp hers briefly. It was 5 years ago now. The pain dulls, but it never quite leaves. No, Grace agreed softly. It doesn't. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and Sarah's soft breathing from her makeshift cradle. What about you? Caleb asked eventually. How did a young woman from a good St. Louis family end up in the Wyoming Territory? Grace sighed. Foolishness, mainly. My father was a banker, conservative and strict. I was his only daughter after my sister died of scarlet fever, and he was determined to see me safely married to a suitable young man from our social circle. But you had other ideas, Caleb guessed. Grace smiled ruefully. I wanted adventure, romance, all the things I'd read about in novels. When Thomas appeared at a social gathering, handsome, charming, full of stories about the West, I was instantly captivated. She shook her head at the memory. He painted such a picture. A growing town, opportunities for prosperity, wide open skies and freedom. And your father disapproved. Vehemently, Grace confirmed. He called Thomas a fortune hunter and a scoundrel. We argued terribly. She looked down at her hands. The last words I said to my father were that he couldn't control my life anymore. 2 weeks later, Thomas and I were married and on a train west. Have you written to your father since? Caleb asked. Grace shook her head. Pride, I suppose. I couldn't bear to admit he'd been right about Thomas all along. He might welcome the chance to know his granddaughter, Caleb suggested gently. The thought had occurred to Grace many times, especially in the difficult weeks after Thomas left. But the prospect of facing her father's judgment, deserved though it might be, had always stopped her. "Perhaps," she said noncommittally. "Someday." The storm continued for 3 days, keeping them confined to the cabin. On the morning of the 4th day, they awoke to brilliant sunshine reflecting off pristine snow. The world outside was transformed into a glittering white expanse, beautiful but treacherous. Caleb spent the day completing the lean-to, insulating it with branches and whatever materials he could find. By nightfall, he had created a small but serviceable shelter attached to the rear of the cabin. "It's not fancy," he said as he showed Grace his handiwork, "but it'll keep out the worst of the cold." "You don't have to move out there yet," Grace said quickly. "It's still freezing at night." Caleb looked at her, his expression unreadable. "People might talk." "There's no one to talk but the chickens," Grace replied with a small smile, "and they don't seem particularly judgmental." That earned a laugh from Caleb. "Well, if the chickens approve, who am I to argue?" As the days passed, their routine deepened into something that felt remarkably like family life. Caleb made trips into town when weather permitted, gradually building up their stock of provisions and becoming a familiar face to the townsfolk. He always returned with news, letters, and occasionally small gifts ribboned for Grace's hair, a carved wooden rattle for Sarah. December arrived, bringing Christmas preparations. Caleb surprised Grace by bringing home a small pine tree, which they decorated with paper stars and strings of dried berries. He carved a simple nativity scene, and Grace taught him the Christmas carols she remembered from her childhood. On Christmas Eve, they sat by the fire after Sarah was asleep, the cabin illuminated only by firelight and the small candles on their modest tree. "I have something for you," Caleb said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a piece of red yarn. "Caleb, you shouldn't have," Grace protested, though she took the package with eager fingers. "It's nothing grand," he said, watching as she carefully untied the yarn. Inside was a silver locket on a delicate chain. Grace gasped softly as she opened it to find a tiny portrait, a remarkably good likeness of Sarah, painted in miniature. "How did you?" she began, tears welling in her eyes. "There's an artist in Pine Creek," Caleb explained. "I described Sarah to him as best I could, and he created the portrait. I hope it's a reasonable likeness." "It's perfect," Grace whispered, closing the locket and clutching it to her chest. "Absolutely perfect." Impulsively, she leaned forward and kissed Caleb's cheek. "Thank you." When she pulled back, his eyes were dark with an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to name. For a breathless moment, she thought he might kiss her properly. Instead, he reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Merry Christmas, Grace," he said softly. "I have something for you too," she said, suddenly shy. She retrieved a package from where she'd hidden it beneath her pillow. Caleb unwrapped it carefully to reveal a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool. "I unraveled one of my old shawls," Grace explained. "It took forever to get it right. I'm not the best knitter." Caleb ran his fingers over the uneven stitches with a reverence that made Grace's heart swell. "It's beautiful," he said. "No one's made me anything like this since my mother died." He wrapped the scarf around his neck, the blue bringing out the flecks of color in his eyes. "How does it look?" "Very handsome," Grace said before she could stop herself. Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, a boundary crossed, a possibility acknowledged. This time, when Caleb leaned forward, Grace met him halfway. The kiss was gentle, questioning at first, then deepening as Grace responded. His hand came up to cup her cheek, and she leaned into his touch, her heart racing with emotions long suppressed. When they finally broke apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the day I found you," he confessed. "Why didn't you?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't want to rush you. You've been through so much." Grace smiled, placing her hand over his heart. "Thank you for waiting, for being patient." That night, Caleb moved his bedroll to the lean-to despite the bitter cold. Some lines, they both agreed, shouldn't be crossed, not yet, not until they were certain of what was growing between them. Christmas Day dawned bright and clear. They exchanged modest gifts with Sarah, who was far more interested in the colorful paper than the soft doll Caleb had brought her from town. They shared a special meal of roasted rabbit and preserved vegetables, and Caleb read the Christmas story from a small Bible he carried in his pack. As the winter deepened, so did their connection. January brought blizzards that kept them homebound for days at a time, but the isolation only strengthened the bonds between them. They shared stories, dreams, fears. Grace told Caleb about her childhood in St. Louis, her love of music and books. Caleb spoke of his years on the frontier, the beauty and harshness of the territories he'd traversed. February arrived with a noticeable shift in Sarah's development. She began pulling herself up on furniture, babbling more consistently, and showing a distinct preference for Caleb, reaching for him whenever he entered the room. "Da!" she exclaimed one evening as he returned from chopping wood. Both adults froze, looking at each other in shock. Did she just? Caleb began. "I think she did," Grace confirmed, a complicated mix of emotions crossing her face. Caleb immediately looked concerned. "I'm sorry, Grace, I never encouraged." "It's all right," Grace interrupted. "She doesn't remember Thomas. You're the only father figure she's known." Still, the moment brought home the temporary nature of their arrangement. Spring would come eventually, and with it, Caleb's departure for Montana. Neither mentioned it, but the unspoken question hung between them. What would happen when winter ended in early March? A thaw began. The snow receded, revealing patches of muddy ground and the first hardy shoots of green. Caleb continued making improvements to the cabin, adding a small porch, reinforcing the walls, expanding the chicken coop. His actions spoke of permanence, but still, they didn't discuss the future. One evening, as they sat on the new porch watching the sunset, Sarah asleep inside, Caleb finally broached the subject. "Spring's coming," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Grace nodded, her stomach knotting with anxiety. "Your friend in Montana will be expecting you." Caleb turned to look at her directly. "Grace, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly without concern for my feelings." Grace's heart pounded painfully in her chest. "All right. Are you happy here with me?" The question was so unexpected, so simple that Grace found herself laughing softly. "Yes," she said. "Happier than I've been in years, perhaps happier than I've ever been." Relief washed over Caleb's face. "Good, that's good." He took her hand, his expression growing serious again. "Because I've been thinking about Montana." Grace steeled herself for the goodbye she'd been dreading. "I'm not going," Caleb said firmly. Grace stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "I'm not going to Montana," he repeated. "Not unless you and Sarah come with me." "But your friend, the cattle operation, can manage without me," Caleb finished. "Or we could go together, start fresh somewhere new, or stay right here if that's what you want. I don't care where we are, Grace, as long as we're together." Grace's mind raced, trying to process his words. "Are you saying?" Caleb slid from the porch bench to one knee before her, still holding her hand. "I'm saying I love you, Grace Reynolds. I love Sarah too, as if she were my own. I know it hasn't been long, and I know you've been hurt before. But I promise you, if you'll have me, I'll spend every day proving that you'll never want for anything again, not food, not shelter, and especially not love." Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks. "Caleb, you don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "Take all the time you need." "I just wanted you to know where I stand." Grace shook her head, smiling through her tears. "I don't need time. I love you too, Caleb Dawson. I think I have since that first night when you brought bread and promised I'd never starve again." Caleb's face lit up with joy. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," Grace laughed. "Yes, I'll marry you." He stood, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. Their kiss was filled with promise, with the certainty of a future together. "There's something else," Caleb said when they finally broke apart. "I wrote to your father." Grace stepped back, shocked. "You did what?" "I found his address in some of your things," Caleb admitted. "I hope you're not angry. I thought he deserved to know his daughter and granddaughter were safe and well." "What did you tell him?" Grace asked, torn between indignation and curiosity. "The truth," Caleb said simply. That Thomas had abandoned you, that I'd found you and Sarah last winter, and that I intended to ask for your hand if you'd have me." "And did he respond?" Grace asked, her voice small. Caleb nodded, reaching into his pocket. "This came with today's mail. I was waiting for the right moment to give it to you." He handed her a letter, the familiar handwriting on the envelope making Grace's heart clench. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the pages within. As she read, fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Her father's words were filled with regret for their estrangement, joy at learning of Sarah's existence, and cautious approval of Caleb based on the character revealed in his letter. "He wants to come visit," Grace said, looking up in wonder. "This summer if we'll have him," Caleb smiled. "I'd like that. I want to meet the man who raised such an extraordinary woman." "He'll be difficult," Grace warned. "Opinionated, stubborn." "Sounds familiar," Caleb teased, earning a playful swat from Grace. "There's more," she said, returning to the letter. "He's offering us money to build a proper house, to buy land of our own." "We don't need his money," Caleb said quietly. "I have savings and I'm not afraid of hard work." Grace touched his face gently. "I know, but this isn't charity, it's his way of making amends, of being part of our lives again." Caleb considered this, then nodded. "If it's important to you, then we'll accept, but on one condition." "What's that?" "That we use some of it to take a proper honeymoon," Caleb said with a grin. "Just a short one. I hear Denver is nice in the summer." Grace laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I think that can be arranged." They were married in late April when the wildflowers were beginning to bloom across the prairie. The ceremony was held in Pine Creek's small church, with many of the townsfolk in attendance. Mr. Davis from the general store gave Grace away, and his wife held Sarah, who babbled happily throughout the proceedings. Caleb wore his army uniform, freshly pressed for the occasion, and Grace wore a new dress of pale blue silk, a gift from her father, who had sent it along with his blessing and a promise to visit in July. As they exchanged vows, Grace marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. A winter storm, a chance encounter, a loaf of bread offered in kindness, these small things had changed the course of her life completely. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. "No more hunger," he whispered against her lips. "Not ever again." Grace knew he wasn't just talking about food. In the years that followed, the small cabin was transformed into a proper home. With her father's financial help and Caleb's skill, they built a sturdy house with multiple rooms, a wrap-around porch, and large windows that let in the Wyoming sunshine. They acquired land, started a small cattle operation, and eventually opened a trading post that served travelers heading west. Sarah grew into a strong-willed, bright young girl who adored her adoptive father. When she was 3, she gained a brother, Thomas Caleb Dawson, named in part for the man whose departure had set their family story in motion. Grace believed in acknowledging the past, even as they built their future. 2 more children followed, Elizabeth Grace and James William, completing their family and filling their home with laughter and occasional chaos. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Caleb surprised Grace with a special gift, a framed portrait of their family, painted by the same artist who had created Sarah's miniature for the locket. In the portrait, Grace held baby James, Caleb had his hand on Thomas's shoulder, and Sarah and Elizabeth stood proudly in front, their faces alight with happiness. "To remind us how far we've come," Caleb said as Grace admired the painting. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat on their porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. Grace leaned against Caleb's shoulder, his arm warm around her. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Not going to Montana, the life you might have had?" Caleb turned to look at her, the love in his eyes as clear and steady as it had been on that snowy night when he'd first appeared at her door. "Not for a single moment," he said, kissing her forehead. "Everything I've ever wanted is right here." As they sat together in the gathering darkness, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them to this place, the hardships, the joys, the unexpected turns that had led to this full and beautiful life. She thought of that desperate winter when she'd believed all was lost, and how a simple act of kindness had changed everything. A loaf of bread, offered freely. A promise kept, a love that had grown from the barren soil of despair into something strong and enduring. "We've been blessed," she murmured, watching as a shooting star traced a brilliant path across the night sky. Caleb squeezed her hand. "Beyond measure," he agreed. And as the Wyoming wind whispered through the cottonwoods surrounding their home, Grace knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true place in the world, not in the genteel parlors of St. Louis, nor in the romantic adventures of her youthful imagination, but here in this hard but beautiful land, with this good man by her side. The hunger that had once defined her existence, not just for food, but for safety, for belonging, for love, had been satisfied completely. And in its place had grown a deep contentment, a joy that sustained her through both the harsh winters and the glorious summers of their shared life. It was, she reflected as Caleb drew her closer, everything she had ever needed, and more than she had dared to hope for on that cold night when a stranger had appeared at her door with bread in his hands and kindness in his heart.